Likutei Sichos, Chelik Yud Ches, Volume 18, the fifth Sicha of Parshas Korach. This Sicha will explain what exactly was the argument, the protest of Korach, and the ensuing commandment in the Torah regarding the matnois kahuna, the various gifts / offerings that the Yidden have to give to the Kohanim, and also how this all connects to the festival of Gimel Tammuz, the third of Tammuz, the day that commemorates the semi-release of the previous Rebbe from his imprisonment, the day that he was sent to Kostroma, as I'll explain in a moment. At the end of the Sikha, the Rebbe also explains in detail the talk that the previous Rebbe gave on that day before he boarded the train to go to Kostroma, to start to serve out this time of exile, at least what was taught at the time. However, we're only going to learn until Ois Yud, until the 10th chapter, as it's a very long Sikha, but we'll definitely cover the main point of the Sikha. So let's go through quickly the timeline to familiarize ourselves better with what happened with the previous Rebbe. So this was in Tov Reish Pei Zayin, that is 1927. He was arrested on the night of the 15th of Sivan, and on the 3rd of Sivan, he was now sent to, quote, exile for 3 years in the city of Kostroma. It wasn't necessarily geographically that far, however, as would be, let's say, Siberia or so on. However, it was far in the sense that it was totally isolated from practical Jewish life. There weren't that many Jews there, and there certainly wasn't a Jewish infrastructure. And then eventually on Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz, in the 12th, 13th of Tammuz, that's when he was notified that he's totally free, and that's when he was able to return home. And then eventually, this also wasn't, so to speak, a quote-unquote full-fledged release, because still he was living in the Soviet Union, which was like, in a sense, the whole country was one big jail. And therefore, at the beginning of the following year, that is Tov Reish Pei Ches, still 1927, but right after Simchas Torah, the previous Rebbe and his family left Russia for Riga, Latvia. So another thing to familiarize ourselves before we get into the Sikha, Chesed and Gevura. Of course, Chesed means kindness. Gevura typically is translated severity, and they correspond to Ratzoi and Shuv. These are concepts which we familiarize ourselves in the past. Ratzoi literally means to thrust, a running thrust forward, meaning the desire to, for example, to remove ourselves from the Gashmias and be totally elevated to Ruchnias, Ratzoi, to run forth. And Shuv, which literally translates return, means to be settled, to come back down. In the terms of serving Hashem, Ratzoi means the desire that we have to remove ourselves from everything and to get close to Hashem. And Shuv is where we have that practical desire, what Hashem wants for us to, quote, return, to be down, grounded here in the earth, and bring down the Ruchnias into the Gashmias, to live here in a practical sense, in a practical manner. Typically, Chesed corresponds to Shuv, as we'll see later, and Gevura corresponds to Ratzai. So let's get into this, to the Sikha. Regarding the close proximity of the story of the Machlokes of Korach, of the argument, the protest of Korach, the division of Korach, to the commandment regarding the matnos kahuna, the various offerings, the various gifts that we give to the Kohen. So the Sifri, the Medrash says, quote, after Korach came and contested the kahuna, Hashem said to Aaron, behold, I am going to, quote, write, sign, and notarize, so to speak, about your kahuna. Thus, this is why Hashem gives the commandment to affirm, to establish that indeed the kahuna is a viable thing, it is a correct thing, it's Hashem's desire, and therefore Hashem details the matnos kahuna. That's what the Medrash says. However, the question is, this would make sense if the commandment that follows the story, the episode, the saga of Korach, would be exclusively about matnos kahuna, about the gifts to the Kohen. But the fact is that it also discusses the laws of Meiser, of Meisers. Meiser goes to the Kohen. The tithing that you give after you give Truma goes to the Levi, forgive me. The Meiser goes to the Levi. So this is not consistent, or it doesn't seem to be consistent with the point that the Medrash is making, that this was kind of a response to the argument of Korach, to the contesting of Korach against the Kahuna. So the question is, what is the connection? It seems that there is a connection because it comes right afterwards. So what would be the connection between the Meiseros and the story of Korach? Moreover, if you think about it, Korach only contested against the Kahuna. Korach himself was a Levi. Korach didn't have any issue with the Leviah, with the fact that they were Leviim. He had an issue with the Kahuna. So why would you have to emphasize, and what reason would there be to, so to speak, reestablish or reaffirm the concept of Leviah? But the fact that the Torah, everything in the Torah is exact and everything is accurate, tells us that there is a connection between what Hashem said afterwards, meaning the Matnos Kahuna, the gifts for the Kohanim, and the gifts for the Levi, the Meiseros, and the whole Machlokes of Korach. So the Rebbe says, and to explain it, the Rebbe begins with an explanation, with an insight from the Noyam Elimelech. There's a sefer called Noyam Elimelech. This is from the holy Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk. You may know him as the brother of Reb Zusha Me'anipoli. And the Rebbe says, it's already been discussed in the past, that the Noyam Elimelech explains that what was the whole idea, what was the whole concept, what was the whole issue of Korach. He says it's expressed in the first words of the parsha. It says, Vayikach Korach, which literally translates, and Korach took. And Rashi even explains it. But what does the Targum say? What does Vayikach mean? And he took? It means V'ispaleg Korach. Korach divided himself. Korach divided. Well, he caused division. That's what he did. That's Machlokes. What does this mean? So this is along the lines of what happened in the 6 days of creation. On the second day, it says that Hashem formed the Rakia Hamavdil Beimayim Lemayim. He formed the firmament, the heaven, the sky, which separates, quote, between water and water. What does that mean? That it makes a separation, that there is Mayim Elyonim, there's Mayim Tachtoinim. There are the upper waters, there are the lower waters. That means that the Korach wanted to emphasize this. His argument was that there is a separation, there is a division between the uppers and the lowers. Meaning, he said as follows. He says, look, what is the idea of a Kohen? Well, in the book of Divrei Hayomim, the book of Chronicles, if you look over there, chapter 23, verse 13, it says, Vayavdel Aaron l'hagdisha kodesh kadashim hu avanav, that Hashem separated Aaron to make him holy, holy of holies, he and his sons. That means that what is the idea of kahuna? To be separate, to be holy. And then, of course, considering that what is the Kohen Gadol in reference to him, it says, Umin hamikdash lo yetze, he should never go out of the mikdash. Meaning, even God forbid, when something terrible happens in his family, there's a loss of life, the regular Kohen mourns. The regular Kohen goes outside of the Beis HaMikdash, figuratively. But the Kohen Gadol not. So his argument was, since that they are so holy and they're so elevated, Madua tisnasu al kal Hashem. Why are you raising yourselves over the congregation of Hashem? This is not to be understood literally, but rather that he was saying, how can you be the ones who raise over the Kahal Hashem? How can you be the ones that are mashpia, that interact with, that affect, or that inspire the Kahal Hashem, the congregation of Hashem? You should be removed. You should be totally separate. You should be, in other words, your mode of service, you, the Kohanim, was Korach's argument, is Havdalah, is to be separate, is to be divided, and what is their avodah of the Yidden? To be down in the earthly things, to be down in the world. So what connection do you have with them? And that was his argument, and that's why he said, I desire to be a Kohen too. I want to be separate. I want to be removed. I appreciate this, but not the way they're doing it. I appreciate only if there's two different things. There is the Elyonim and there's Tachtoinim. And now we could understand the connection to the Matnos Kahuna, to the gifts for the Kohanim. What is Matnos Kahuna? it emphasizes the connection that there is between the Kohen and the regular Jew. The Yid gives from his possession to the Kohen, meaning that they elevate from the things that belong to them and they become a gift to the Kohen, which is essentially a way that they're giving it to Hashem. So they're taking the Tachtoin, they're taking from the lower element, and they're elevating it through the Kohen to the highest of high, to Hashem himself. So that explains now the connection. However, this makes sense, but there's still one question. The question that remains is, if this is the whole purpose, namely, that the reason why Hashem said it right after the argument of Korach was to emphasize, was to illustrate how there is a connection between the higher and the lower. If so, perhaps, maybe, it would have been more appropriate to discuss korbanos. What happens by a korban? By a korban, you take the tachton, you take an animal, which is a simple animal in itself, it's just very tachton, very lowly, and you consecrate it, and you make it into a korban, and it gets totally elevated to Hashem. Especially a korban oila goes totally up to Hashem. So why did Hashem specifically pick the concept, the idea of matnes kohuna to counter the machlekes of Korach? And if you think about it, moreover, when you look at a korban, after it gets consecrated, like I said, it gets totally elevated to Hashem. It becomes totally spiritual. You can even see that in the Beis HaMikdash, the smoke going straight up to the heavens. Whereas by the Kohen, even when it becomes quote-unquote holy, and the Kohen has to treat it as a holy item, still, how does the Kohen consume it? I'm sorry, the Kohen has to consume it. In other words, how does it get connected to the Kohen? By him enjoying it, which is still something connected to the Tachton. So it doesn't seem. So why did Hashem pick korbanos as why did he not pick korbanos as a symbol, as a response, as an argument to counter Korach's argument? Why did he pick specifically the idea of matnes kahuna? So the Rebbe says, Parshas Korach is always read in proximity to Gimel Tammuz. And since everything is by hashgacha pratis, by divine providence, and especially considering what the Shalah maintains, Shalah is Rabbi Yitzchak Horowitz, his work is called Shalah, Shnei Luches Abris, who he maintains that the Yomim Tovim, the various festivals, that the parshas that they coincide with around those festivals have this direct connection to the festival. So then there must be a connection between Parshas Korach and Gimel Tammuz. Says the Rebbe, we could actually appreciate and understand this unique connection between Parshas Korach and what happened on Gimel Tammuz. You see, the previous Rebbe had much opposition. There was much opposition, obviously, from the Soviets, from the KGB, and so on. But really, what were they opposed to? If you think about it, what they were really opposed to was not he himself being a religious Jew, not he himself being a pious Jew, not he himself learning Chassidus, but rather the work that he did to connect to the regular Jew, the work that he was doing to spread Yiddishkeit to the average Jew, to the, I don't want to use the term lowly Jew, but to the regular low Jew, low down-to-earth Jew, to the little kids. That was their beef. That was their problem. That was their issue. And this is, of course, similar to what happened by Korach. He maintained, you're a Kohen, no problem, but you should be elevated. You shouldn't mix with the people. You don't have a connection to the people because there should be a division between the Elyonim and Tachtonim. And this is what Gimel Tammuz came about and shows that Hashem, so to speak, just like he said to Aaron, he wrote, he signed, he notarized the fact that he is authorizing that this is the way it is, that you could continue spreading Torah to the masses, and you, the Kohen, in this sense, the Rebbe, could and should still be connected to the people and continue to spread Torah to them. So this makes a lot of sense. However, this still is somewhat of a discrepancy. It's not 100% the same. Because if you think about it, what really happened on Gimel Tammuz? If you recall the timeline, on Gimel Tammuz, he wasn't totally freed. He wasn't given totally the green light. Now you can go out there and go spread Yiddishkeit. But rather, he was sent to exile. So true that the worst was commuted. And the worst, I didn't want to say it verbalize it, like the Rebbe would never verbalize it to say Chas v'Shalom that they were considering capital punishment, but the worst was commuted, and not even to sit in jail, to just go there, it's a semi-freedom. But the fact is, he wasn't totally free. He was still under their jurisdiction, still under their thumb. Now, the virtue of the fact that he was in Kostrama tells us that he wasn't free. And he didn't become totally free until Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz. So how can we say that it's compared? How can we say it's similar to Parshas Korach when after Korach was done with, the kahuna was totally and absolutely reestablished? Says the Rebbe, and therefore we must conclude that specifically because of this, the fact that he was still under their thumb, so to speak, he was still under their jurisdiction and their authority, as he was sent to exile, Dafka, because of this is what brings out even more so the idea, the concept of the machlekes of Korach versus the response of Hashem with the matnes kahuna. So the Rebbe says, in order to understand this, we'll understand this by first getting a little better on the appreciation of matnes kahuna, of some of the halachas in the gifts of the kohanim, and we'll appreciate and answer a certain question that arises, and we'll be able to really fully understand this and see how the two come together. You see, the rule is, by matnes kahuna, that there is a precise quota, there's a precise limit. In other words, there is a minimum, even though according to the Torah there may not be a minimum, let's say in Truma, but the Chachamim established, the sages established a minimum. Either you give a 50th, which is 2%, or at least a 60th, or the most you can give is a 40th. But the rule is that you cannot give everything away. In other words, if a person is feeling overly generous and excited about the kahuna, he still cannot take his whole entire harvest and give it to the kohen. Something has to remain. In other words, there is a minimum and there's a maximum share. And the question is why? Why shouldn't you just be able to give everything away? The answer is, it's explained in the Chassidus, that a kohen, what does a kohen symbolize? What does a kohen represent? A kohen is ish hachesed. It represents chesed, kindness. What's kindness? Givingness. This corresponds to the concept of shuv, which is basically the idea of giving milmaila lemata. In other words, that the focus is not on the lamaila, the focus is not on the upper, but rather as it comes down and it's able to help, or it's able to energize and elevate, serve as a purpose for the mata, the shuv, the return. Whereas Levi represents, the Leviim represent gevura, severity, which is ratzoi. This corresponds to ratzoi, which is that thrust forward, which is the idea of milmata l'mayla, where the tachton wants to remove itself from being tachton and go totally up and get absorbed in the mayla. So what did Korach want? Korach wanted that everybody should get elevated, because he felt that the tachtonim, the lower ones, meaning the regular Jew or the Jews as they are, with their feet on the ground, so to speak, they are not compatible to godliness the way they are. And therefore they have to cease being who they are, and they have to elevate themselves, remove themselves from being a tachton, and somehow become an elyon, which is the idea of ratzoi. And therefore they felt like the kohen shouldn't go down to the people. What was the response for this? Now we'll appreciate it. It was not the korbanos. Because what is a korban? A korban is that you take something and the entire thing becomes transformed. It becomes consecrated to Hashem. It becomes kodesh, and then it gets totally elevated to Hashem. In other words, it ceases being a tachton. It no longer is a tachton. This is the idea of ratzoi, which has its place. But this is not a response to the argument of Korach. What was a response to the argument of Korach? Dafke matnes kahuna. That what happens, only a part of it gets elevated. But the rest, and this is the emphasis, that's why it's no less and no more. You can't give everything away. You can't convert the whole thing into holiness. You have to remain with the tachton. From the tachton, you take some elyon, you take some matter of it, and you convert it into elyon. But the tachton itself, the contributor, remains a tachton, and that's how he gets connected to God. This is fantastic, says the Rebbe. However, there's still somewhat of a question of discrepancy. Because at the end of the day, the matnos kuna itself, the portion itself that you separated and gave to the kohen does become kodesh. It does become, quote, elyon, elevated into a higher status. So it's not fully representing this idea, because we're trying to focus on how the tachton should remain a tachton. In other words, the idea of shuv, and yet it serves God, and through that it's able to accomplish the feat of making a dira betachton of serving God. Therefore, says the Rebbe, that's why the Torah also adds the idea of the Meiser to the Levi. The idea of Meiser does not become Kodesh. Whereas when you give something to the Kohen, let's say, for example, when you give Truma from your harvest, or the Bikurim, that is holy, because even the Kohen himself has to treat it with holiness. But Meiser is totally chulin. It totally remains mundane, regular. He can do whatever he wants with it. He doesn't have to treat it with any whatsoever kid gloves in terms of holiness. There's no restrictions whatsoever. This brings out the idea that it can remain a tachton and still be totally and absolutely connected to the Elyon. That means not only the part that the Kohen and Levi receive serve the purpose of serving Hashem, but rather the part that remains by the person, that remains, so to speak, pure tachton, pure and absolute tachton. With that, you're able to, and therefore you have to serve Hashem. And this is the reason why there is an established shiur, no more, no less. There's a quota. You cannot give more, you cannot give less. There are limitations. Because this is to emphasize that you're supposed to be left, the person is supposed to be left with the tachton, with his matter, in order to be able to serve Hashem. By him enjoying it, by him using it for his purposes, dafka through that, he's able to serve Hashem. And now we'll understand how this really connects specifically to Gimel Tammuz. If we look at it this way, the machlekes of Korach corresponds to the arrest, their arguments. Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, the ultimate release, that is when he went totally out of the clutches, that was as if like they totally admitted that he could serve in the capacity of what he's doing until then. But that's already where it kind of, so to speak, all became like holy. In other words, that corresponds more, if I may, to the idea of korbanos. But Dafka Gimel Tammuz, when he was kind of released, but not totally, he was still under their thumb. He was still under their jurisdiction. He was in exile. By virtue of the fact that he was there, it tells us that he was under their rule. And yet, he was able to start, once again, he was able to act and bring Torah and mitzvahs, which we know, in the account of it, what happens? He immediately, as he was setting out there, right before he set out, he already sent somebody ahead to establish a cheder, to establish a cheder for little children to learn Torah, exactly the reason what he was arrested for, and to fix the mikveh there, and to see to it that there's Torah learning there. So in other words, the fact that he was released from jail gave him that ability to do it, while being under the clutches, in this case, there's no worse tachton, of the tachton itself. So this represents, symbolizes how it is the ultimate tikkun, the ultimate correction, the ultimate counter-argument to Korach's argument. That while being in the tachton, in the gashmi, as they are gashmi, you're not only, it doesn't serve as a stira, as a contradiction to godliness, but adarabah dafka, through that you're able to do godliness. And if you think about it, if he had not been sent to Kastrama, to this tachton, he wouldn't have had a direct connection to that place to focus in on that particular place and accomplish the Torah and mitzvahs that he actually accomplished because he was there. So this brings out the idea how the tachton itself serves the purpose, and this is the ultimate counter argument to Korach and the concept of Korach, which in this Sikha the Rebbe aligns with what the communists were arguing. You be up there, let the people be down there. That's what Korach was saying, and the response to it is Matnes Kuhuna and Meiser, which says, no, there is a tachton, and dafka with the tachton, through the tachton, because of the tachton, that's how we serve Hashem.